It was a cold, relentless night in January, one of those nights where the snow never seems to stop falling. I was working the night shift at a cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Well, not nowhere, but close enough. The cabin was located on the outskirts of a small mountain town in Colorado, surrounded by dense forests and jagged peaks. It was the kind of place people went to escape the chaos of city life, to retreat into the quiet. Except, at that moment, quiet felt like the last thing I wanted. I was 32 years old, working a job as the caretaker of the cabin. The pay wasn't bad, and it offered the kind of solitude that some people craved, but it came with its own set of problems, mainly the isolation. The cabin was small, built from thick timber, and the walls creaked and groaned whenever the wind picked up. The fireplace in the main room was usually the only source of warmth, and the flickering flames often made the shadows dance in strange ways across the walls. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. Tonight, the snowstorm was bad, worse than usual. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows, and the snow came down in heavy sheets. The heater was working overtime, but it still didn't seem to make much of a difference. I tried to focus on the logs I was splitting for the fire, my axe moving rhythmically, but the cold seeped into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. The storm had been getting stronger as the night went on, and now it was starting to feel like the world outside had completely disappeared. I could barely see the path leading up to the cabin through the thick sheets of snow. The only thing keeping me from feeling completely cut off from the world was the occasional crackling of the fire and the soft, comforting hum of the cabin's old generator that powered the lights and kept the place running. I had my own routine at night, one that made the hours feel like they went by faster. I'd start by checking the fire, then turn to making sure the water pipes hadn't frozen. Next, I'd scan the windows for any signs of movement. Most nights, there was nothing. But on nights like this, when the storm was at its worst, you never knew what to expect. Around midnight, I started hearing things. It wasn't anything loud or obvious, just small noises. The floorboards creaked from the other room, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the wood. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lights flickered, then went out for a second. I froze, holding my breath. The generator was old, and I often had to give it a little nudge to keep it running properly. I walked over to the panel and gave it a tap, but the lights didn't come back on immediately. Instead, the cabin plunged into complete darkness, and the only thing I could hear was the wind outside and the sound of my own heart racing in my chest. The silence felt too heavy. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, my hands shaking more than I cared to admit. As I clicked it on, the beam sliced through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The cabin felt a lot bigger in the dark, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't see the windows, and the storm outside only made everything feel more distant. I made my way to the window, trying to peer through the frost that had built up on the glass. The wind howled louder now, and I could barely make out the trees outside, bent low under the weight of the snow. I had to squint to see if anything moved. Nothing. Still, there was that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, the one that told me I wasn't alone. After a few minutes, I got the generator running again. The lights flickered to life, dim but steady. I sighed in relief, but the unease still hung over me like a thick fog. It wasn't just the storm. It was the sense of something being off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I went to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea, trying to settle my nerves. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that only made my mind wander. I set the kettle on the stove, the soft whistling sound of it barely cutting through the silence. That's when I heard it again. A loud thump, followed by a scraping sound. It came from the back of the cabin, from the direction of the old shed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't the wind. The noise was too deliberate, too close. Something or someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight again, my mind racing with possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? I didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was close. I couldn't afford to ignore it. I went to the closet near the front door and grabbed the rifle I kept stored there, just in case. It was old but functional. As I stepped outside into the freezing air, the snow hit my face like 1,000 needles. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the swirling snow, but I kept moving toward the shed. Every step I took made the snow crunch underfoot, louder than it should have been in the dead of night. I reached the shed. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see fresh tracks in the snow leading up to it. Big tracks, not animal tracks, human tracks. I froze. A cold chill ran through me, more intense than the storm. My mind raced, running through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road had been impassable for days. There was no way anyone could have made it out here in this weather. I pushed the shed door open slowly, the rusted hinges squealing in protest. The flashlight's beam fell on the empty interior, and for a moment, I felt the relief of thinking it was just a false alarm. But that's when I noticed the footprints leading into the back corner. They were fresh. I stepped inside, my boots sinking into the wet snow that had somehow found its way in. My flashlight landed on a pile of equipment. Old boxes, a few rusted tools, but there was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A blood-stained rag. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind spun, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned quickly, but as I did, I heard it. A voice or something that sounded like it. A low, almost inaudible growl. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around. I didn't even think. I ran, straight back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled to lock it, my heart pounding in my chest. I bolted the door, slid the security chain into place, and then backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. I didn't know what I'd heard out there in the shed. I didn't know what had left the tracks, but whatever it was close. That night, I didn't sleep. The storm raged on, louder than ever, but the noises stopped. The creaks in the cabin, the scraping sounds from outside, they all disappeared. It was too quiet, too still, and I was left alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, on a night when nothing seemed right. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a simple trip to the cabin my dad built in the middle of nowhere. I'd been there before, plenty of times, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But this time, it felt different. The cabin sat right on the edge of a large lake, tucked away in a secluded part of the forest. It was the kind of place that, in daylight, seemed peaceful and beautiful. The trees were tall, the water was calm, and the air smelled fresh. At night, though, everything shifted. It wasn't just the typical creaks and groans you get in an old cabin. It was something else. I had driven up alone this time. My dad had passed a couple of years ago, and my family didn't visit much anymore. I used to love the cabin when I was younger, so I figured it would be good for me to spend some time there on my own. Just me, a few days of fishing, and the quiet. When I arrived, everything was just as I remembered. The wooden deck was a little more weathered, the windows a little dirtier, but the place was standing strong. I unloaded my gear and made my way inside. The place was dark, so I flicked on the lights and started a fire in the stove to get some warmth in the place. The sun set, and I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. There were a few bird calls in the distance, the rustling of trees, and the occasional splash from something in the water. I was hoping to catch some fish in the morning, but for now, I was just enjoying the peace. Around midnight, I started hearing it. At first, it was just a soft noise, like something brushing against the cabin. I figured it was just the wind, but then the sound got louder. It wasn't the wind anymore. It sounded like something was moving around the place, scraping against the side of the building. I stood up, trying to figure out if it was an animal or just some tree branches shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the deck, shining it around. I didn't see anything at first. The woods were still, dark, and quiet. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I went back inside and locked the door, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next morning, I headed out early for fishing. I fished all day and barely caught anything. The lake had always been pretty stocked, so this was strange. But I wasn't in a rush. The sun was high, and it felt good to be out on the water. When I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints near the door, leading up to the cabin and stopping at the porch. I knelt down, examining the prints. They were large, too big for a deer, and deep like whoever made them was walking with purpose. My heart started to race. No one else was supposed to be out here. I checked the area around the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I wanted to believe it was just some stray animal, but these tracks didn't make sense. They were too clear, too deliberate. That night, I decided to stay up. I left the porch light on, hoping to get a glimpse of whoever or whatever had been around. I sat near the window, the curtain pulled back just enough to see outside, but not enough to be seen myself. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the scraping noise. It was coming from the side of the cabin, just like before. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the door. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped outside and shone the light on the side of the cabin. There, by the edge of the woods, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just some shadow, but then the flashlight caught it. A tall man, hunched over slightly, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his body clearly. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. For a moment, everything was still. I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Hello," I called out, but my voice sounded weak in the quiet night. The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. I took a step toward him, my feet crunching on the gravel. He didn't flinch. My heart was pounding now, my entire body tense. I called out again, louder this time. Still no response. I took another step. That's when he turned his head just enough for me to see his face. His skin was pale, his eyes dark and sunken. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill shoot through me, like he was looking right into my soul. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and backed away from the window. I stayed by the wall for what felt like hours, listening to the silence outside. No sounds of movement, no footsteps. It was as if the man had never been there at all. But I knew he had. The next morning, I didn't even want to leave the cabin. But the only way out was to drive, and I knew that I couldn't just leave things like this. I spent hours pacing, trying to figure out what to do. The phone signal was spotty, and I wasn't about to walk through the woods with that man still out there. That afternoon, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin again. This time, I noticed something more. The tracks from the previous day were still there, but now they led toward the woods. And not just a few steps, but deeper into the forest, as if someone or something had been watching the cabin for days. I didn't stick around much longer. I packed up everything I could, grabbed my gear, and left the cabin. As I was loading up the truck, I glanced back at the woods. I thought I saw a figure, standing still, watching me from behind a tree. I wasn't sure if it was the same man, but I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. When I got home, I called the local sheriff. I didn't know what to tell them, What could I say? That I saw a creepy guy in the woods who just stared at me? It didn't sound real, even to me. The sheriff came by later that week to investigate. They found nothing. No signs of anyone living in the woods. No evidence of trespassing. Nothing to explain what had happened. They chalked it up to a wild animal or maybe a drifter passing through. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I wasn't going back to that cabin anytime soon. I still wonder sometimes, when I think about it late at night, if the man in the woods was real. But I don't want to know the answer. Some things are better left unanswered. And the cabin? Still there, empty, waiting. But I don't think anyone's brave enough to visit it now. And I'm sure as hell not going back. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe I just wanted a quiet weekend. Maybe I just didn't think things through. But looking back, I should have known better. It was early October when I booked the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place in the middle of the woods, a couple of hours outside the city. My wife, Claire, wanted a break from work, and her stepsister, Rachel, had just finished a stressful semester of college. A weekend out in nature sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got worse the deeper we went into the forest. At first, it was just cracked pavement, but soon it turned into a dirt road, barely wide enough for the truck. Trees stretched over the path, blocking out most of the sunlight. My GPS kept trying to reroute, but I had already saved the directions. When we finally reached the cabin, something about it felt off. It looked fine, old but sturdy, built out of dark wood, with a small front porch and a stone chimney. But there was something about how quiet it was that made me uneasy. I told myself I was just tired. We carried our bags inside. The inside was simple. A main room with a couch and a fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Everything smelled like dust and old wood. Rachel wrinkled her nose and muttered something about the smell, but I ignored it. After unpacking, I stepped outside to get some firewood. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't ours. They were older, but not by much. Someone had been here recently, but the cabin was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was probably the owner checking on the place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, we built a fire in the fireplace and had dinner. Claire and Rachel laughed about something on Rachel's phone, but I wasn't really paying attention. I kept looking at the front door, half expecting someone to knock. Nothing happened. Eventually, we went to bed. Claire and I took the bigger bedroom, and Rachel took the smaller one down the hall. I don't know what woke me up that night. Maybe it was just the cold. Maybe it was something else. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin was silent, except for the wind outside. But after a few minutes, I heard it. A sound from outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard it again. Soft footsteps moving around the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow, careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. I sat up and reached for my phone. No service. Of course. I looked at Claire, but she was still asleep. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. I got up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window. The glass was old and dirty, but I could still see the front yard. Nothing. I stood there for a long time watching, but there was nothing out there, just darkness. After a while, I went back to bed. I told myself it was just my imagination. In the morning, everything felt normal again. The sunlight made the cabin feel warmer, safer. I almost forgot about the noises from the night before. Almost. Rachel wanted to explore, so we hiked a little through the woods. The trees were tall, the ground covered in fallen leaves. It should have been peaceful, but the whole time I felt like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder. I never saw anything, but I could feel it. After an hour, I made up an excuse to head back. As we got closer to the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach drop. More footprints, fresh ones, and they led from the trees to the front door. Someone had been here while we were gone. I didn't say anything to Claire or Rachel. I didn't want to scare them, but I checked the cabin carefully before we went inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. Whoever had been here hadn't taken anything. They had just looked around. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my heart pound. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved along the side of the cabin, slow and steady. I sat up, holding my breath. The footsteps reached the back of the cabin. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The back door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed the hunting knife I had packed and moved toward the door as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking. The rattling stopped. Then silence. I stood there in the dark, waiting. After what felt like forever, I heard footsteps again. But this time they were moving away. Whoever it was, they had given up. For now. The next morning, I told Claire and Rachel we were leaving. They didn't argue. They could tell something was wrong. As we packed up, I noticed something strange near the trees. A small pile of rocks. At first, I thought it was just random. But then I saw another pile. And another. Someone had placed them there all around the cabin. I don't know why. We left as fast as we could. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing there, watching us leave. Then it was gone. I never told Claire or Rachel about the footprints, or the door handle, but I knew one thing for sure. Whoever had been outside that cabin, they had been waiting for us to leave, and I don't think they were planning to let us leave alive. I was never the type to believe in things that couldn't be explained. I liked facts, things I could see and understand. But after what happened in that cabin in the French countryside, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was early October a few years back. My friend Adrian had a family cabin deep in the woods near the Pyrenees, an old hunting lodge his grandfather had built decades ago. He invited me to stay for a long weekend, just the two of us. No phone service, no distractions, just hunting, hiking, and drinking by the fire. It sounded perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon, the trees lining the narrow dirt road thick and dark, their branches clawing at the sky. The cabin was small, made of old wood that had darkened with time. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense and untouched. Inside, the place smelled like pine and old leather. The main room had a fireplace, a table, and a few worn-out chairs. A narrow hallway led to two small bedrooms. There was no electricity, just an old generator Adrian said we'd only use if necessary. We spent the first evening drinking by the fire, talking about nothing important. Outside, the forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animals, just silence. I woke up in the middle of the night, needing to pee. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The trees loomed over me, their shadows stretching long across the ground. I walked a few steps away from the cabin and relieved myself. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle, long and slow, coming from the trees. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw were the endless trees. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe even Adrian messing with me. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The next day, we spent most of our time hiking and setting up for hunting. There was no sign of anyone else in the area. No footprints, no campsites, nothing. But that night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. Slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. The floorboards on the porch creaked under the weight of something or someone walking back and forth. I held my breath, listening. Then came a soft knock on the door. Not loud, just deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. My body was frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The knocking stopped, but I could still hear the footsteps. Then something worse. A voice. It was low and strained, like someone trying to imitate human speech but not getting it quite right. Adrian. I felt my stomach drop. It sounded like my voice. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. When I finally stepped outside, there were no footprints, nothing to show that someone had been there. But I knew what I heard. Adrian said it was probably a wild animal, maybe even a trick of the wind. But I saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't convinced either. The third night was the worst. We had just finished eating when we heard movement outside. A shuffling sound, followed by that same slow, whistling tune. Then a voice called out, "Adrian, open the door." It was my voice again. I grabbed the rifle we had brought for hunting, my hands shaking. Adrian was already holding his. We didn't move. We just stood there, staring at the door, waiting. The footsteps moved around the cabin. The whistle came again, closer this time. Then, from the small window beside the door, I saw it. A figure, tall, too tall to be a normal person. His limbs looked wrong, too long, too thin. The skin was pale, almost gray. And its face, it looked like me, but it wasn't. The eyes were wrong, the mouth stretched too wide. It was like something wearing my face as a mask. Pressed its hand against the window, fingers too long, too bony. Then it spoke again. "Let me in." We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the center of the room, guns ready, waiting for sunrise. By morning, it was gone. No footprints, no signs of anything. But we packed our things and left. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I was never one for hunting, but my older cousin, Mark, lived for it. Every fall, he'd disappear into the woods for days, tracking deer and setting up camp deep in the mountains. He always invited me, but I'd never gone, until last year. I still wish I hadn't. Mark had a small hunting cabin about 20 miles from town, deep in the Appalachian woods. It was an old, one-room place, built by his grandfather in the 60s. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a few bunks, and an outhouse out back. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. No roads led to it, you had to hike in with all your gear. I finally agreed to go in late October. The idea of being alone in the woods for a few days made me uneasy, but Mark had been hunting out there for years without a problem. He promised it'd be an easy trip, just some deer tracking, campfires, and a few beers at night. We left town before sunrise, driving Mark's truck as far up the logging roads as we could. From there, we hiked 6 miles with our gear on our backs. The forest was thick, the trail barely visible beneath the fallen leaves. The air was cold, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled my nose. The cabin looked exactly how I expected. Weathered, dark wood, a metal roof rusted at the edges. The windows were small, almost too small, and the front door had deep claw marks near the bottom, probably from a bear. Mark laughed when I pointed it out. He said it was old, nothing fresh. Inside, the cabin was bare bones. 2 wooden bunks, a table, and an old iron stove in the corner. There was a small cabinet with some canned food and a few old hunting knives hanging on the wall. Mark dropped his pack and started unpacking while I lit the stove. We spent the afternoon scouting. The forest was dead quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the brush. We found a few good spots for hunting and marked them with strips of orange tape. As the sun set, we hiked back. That first night, we ate chili by lantern light. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak. Something about the silence beyond the cabin walls made me uneasy. Mark joked that it was just nature, but I barely slept. The next morning, we set out early. Mark took me to a ridge about a mile from the cabin, a spot where he'd seen deer before. We sat quietly, waiting, rifles in hand. A few hours passed, but we didn't see anything. Mark decided to scout a bit further ahead. I stayed behind, keeping my eyes on the tree line. That's when I saw them, tracks in the mud, just below the ridge. At first, I thought they were from a deer, but something was off. They were long, almost human-like, but wider, deeper. The way they pressed into the dirt told me whoever or whatever had made them was heavy. I called Mark over. He studied them, frowning. He muttered that they were probably from a bear, but I could tell he didn't believe it. The tracks were too long, too narrow for a bear. And there was something else, the way they trailed off into the woods in a straight line. Not wandering, not searching, just moving with purpose. We followed them for a while, but they led deeper into the trees, toward an area Mark never hunted. Eventually, he decided to turn back. We'd lost too much daylight already. That night, the wind died down, but the silence felt heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Sometime past midnight, I woke up. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. The only sound was the occasional pop of burning wood. Then I heard it, a noise outside, soft at first, then louder. Heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves. Not a deer, not a bear, something walking upright. I held my breath. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded. I wanted to wake Mark, but something told me to stay still. The steps stopped near the front door. Then the door handle rattled. I gripped my rifle, barely breathing. The handle rattled again, harder this time. The wood creaked under the pressure. Then silence. I sat there, every muscle locked, waiting. Minutes passed. Then footsteps moving away, slowly back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I told Mark what I'd heard. He frowned but didn't say much. We stepped outside, rifles ready. The dirt around the cabin was disturbed. Something or someone had walked the perimeter, circling the cabin multiple times. And then we saw the tracks, the same ones from the ridge. Long, narrow, too deep to be human. Mark didn't say a word. He just nodded, went inside, and started packing. I didn't argue. We left everything but the essentials, hiking back to the truck as fast as we could. The whole way, I felt like we were being watched. The trees felt too still. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. When we finally reached the truck, I expected relief, but instead, I felt something else. Like we'd only just escaped something we weren't meant to see. We never went back to that cabin. Mark sold it a few months later. Told me he just didn't have time for hunting anymore. I never asked if he heard the footsteps that night. Some things are better left alone. I bought the cabin on a whim. It wasn't the smartest decision, but it felt right at the time. The idea of owning a place deep in the woods, away from the noise and pressure of everyday life, had been something I dreamed about for years. I had spent too much time in the city, working a job that drained me, surrounded by people but feeling completely alone. So, when I saw the listing for a small, affordable cabin near a place called Lost Lake, I jumped on it. It was deep in the forests of northern Montana, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The place was old, built sometime in the 60s, but solid. A simple one-story structure with a loft, a wood stove, and just enough modern amenities to make it livable. The previous owner had died, and his family wanted to sell it fast. They didn't ask for much, and I didn't ask many questions. By the time I drove up there in late October, the leaves had turned, and the air had a sharp bite. The road leading to the cabin was a winding dirt path, barely maintained, with overgrown trees on both sides. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the rest of the world behind. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No traffic, no distant hum of life, just the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful in a way I wasn't used to. The place had been empty for a while, so it had that stale and used smell, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with some fresh air. I spent the first few days cleaning, fixing up little things, making it feel like mine. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was part of the appeal. I wanted the isolation. The first week was uneventful. I settled into a routine, chopping wood, hiking the trails around the lake, reading by the fire at night. The stillness was almost unsettling at first, but I told myself I'd get used to it. Then little things started happening. One morning, I found the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but I figured maybe I hadn't latched it all the way. The wind was strong that night. Maybe it had pushed it open. A few days later, I woke up to find my boots outside, sitting neatly on the porch. I had left them inside next to the door. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to remember if I had moved them myself. I hadn't. It was easy to explain away, though. Maybe I had been half asleep and forgot. Maybe I had absent-mindedly placed them there and didn't remember. But then there were the noises. At night, I started hearing movement outside. Not the usual sounds of the forest. These were heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. At first, I convinced myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear. But it didn't feel like an animal. One night, I sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and careful, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat completely still. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin to see if I could find tracks. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but about 20 yards from the cabin, I found something. A trail. It wasn't one I had noticed before. It was narrow, winding into the woods behind my cabin, overgrown but still visible. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, but someone recently had cleared parts of it. I followed it. It led deeper into the forest, twisting through the trees. I walked for what felt like miles, my skin crawling the entire time. Something about the trail felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. Then I saw it. An old, rotting shack, barely standing, hidden between thick trees. It looked abandoned. The roof was caved in on one side, the walls covered in moss. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the damp ground. The door was slightly open, swaying in the breeze. I peered inside. The smell hit me first. Rotting wood, damp earth, and something else. Something foul. The inside was dark, but I could make out a pile of blankets in the corner, a rusted lantern, and something that made my stomach drop. Food wrappers. Recent ones. Someone had been here. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. As I turned to go, I heard something behind me, a twig snapping. I ran. I locked every door and window when I got back to the cabin. I told myself it was just an old shelter that maybe hunters used it sometimes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the axe I kept next to the door. Then nothing. The next morning, I found something on my porch, a single muddy boot print. Not mine. I packed my bags. I decided to leave at sunrise. I wanted to believe I was overreacting, but my gut told me otherwise. I barely turned off the lights that night, keeping my axe within reach. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, and the room was cold. I glanced at the window, and my blood turned to ice. A face. It was there, just outside the glass. I couldn't see details, just the outline, the way the light caught the shape of a head, shoulders. They weren't moving, just standing, watching. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, they backed away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bags and ran to my truck. The road back to town had never felt longer. Every shadow, every movement in the trees sent waves of panic through me. I never went back. I put the cabin up for sale the next day. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted it gone. A few months later, I got a call from the realtor. The new owner had started some renovations and found something buried under the floorboards. A box. Inside were old photographs, newspaper clippings, and something that made my stomach churn. A worn-out journal, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. The last entry? He watches at night. He waits. I locked the doors, but it doesn't matter. He always finds a way inside. I never asked what happened to the previous owner. I don't want to know, and I don't want to know who or what was out there in those woods. I just know I'm never going back. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just graduated college. After months of dealing with the stress of final exams, I needed some time away from everything. I wanted peace, quiet, and a chance to recharge. So, when a friend of a friend mentioned a small farm cabin in the French countryside that was available for rent, I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin was located in a remote area, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, nestled between rolling hills and vast fields. It was one of those places you'd see in a postcard, small, rustic, and charming. I was thrilled about the idea of spending a week in complete solitude, away from the noise of daily life. The drive from the train station took longer than I expected. The roads grew narrower and less paved as I ventured deeper into the countryside. I had rented a small car for the trip, and as I made my way through the winding lanes, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. The trees crowded in on either side, the dense forest feeling almost suffocating. I passed a few scattered farms and stone houses, but it was clear this was a sparsely populated area. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted the cabin. It was a single-story stone structure with a thatched roof. The wooden door creaked when I opened it, but inside, it was cozy, just a simple living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. The furniture was old but comfortable, with faded chairs and a wooden table in the center of the room. The windows overlooked a field of tall grass that stretched out to the edge of the forest. It was beautiful and peaceful, just what I needed. That night, I decided to take a walk around the property. The air was cool, and the stars above were so clear, it almost felt like I could touch them. I wandered to the edge of the field and stood for a while, taking in the silence. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional croak of a distant frog. I was beginning to feel more relaxed when I noticed something strange. At the far end of the field, near the treeline, there was a small structure, a barn, perhaps. I didn't remember seeing it when I arrived. It was barely visible in the darkness, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't so much the barn itself, but the fact that it seemed out of place. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I returned to the cabin and decided to get some rest. The next few days were spent exploring the surrounding area. The landscape was stunning: wide, open fields, dense forests, and the occasional quiet stream. I walked for hours each day, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of it all. But there was one thing that began to bother me. Every time I ventured out, I noticed signs that someone else had been around. Small footprints in the dirt, broken twigs, the faint scent of tobacco or something else that was hard to place. At first, I thought it was just local wildlife, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. There was no one around for miles. No neighbors, no other houses. Just the cabin and the empty fields. One evening, after a long walk, I decided to get some firewood for the fireplace. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the field. As I walked toward the small shed behind the cabin, I noticed a faint sound, a soft tapping noise, like someone was knocking on wood. I paused, listening intently. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I turned and scanned the field, but there was no one in sight. I brushed it off as my nerves getting the better of me and continued gathering wood. But the tapping continued, growing louder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and decided to stay inside. I told myself I was just overthinking things, that the tapping was probably an animal or the wind. But the unease lingered. I stayed up late, staring at the flickering fire, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The following day, I decided to take a trip into the nearest village. I needed to get away from the isolation for a while. The village was small, with cobblestone streets and a handful of shops. I bought some supplies, chatted with a few locals, and tried to shake the strange feeling that had been creeping up on me. When I returned to the cabin, everything seemed normal except for one thing. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left. My heart started to race. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting to find someone waiting for me. But the cabin was empty. There was nothing unusual, nothing except for the faint smell of tobacco, stronger than before. It filled the air, lingering like a presence in the room. I spent the next few days on edge. The tapping came more frequently, and I started noticing small things being out of place. A chair moved slightly, a cup missing from the shelf. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me question my own sanity. I didn't tell anyone, not wanting to sound paranoid. One evening, after an especially long walk, I decided to confront whatever was causing this unease. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the barn I had seen days earlier. The field was empty, but the barn loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the ground. I felt a tight knot in my stomach as I walked toward it. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The barn door was slightly open, just like the cabin door had been. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the darkness inside almost suffocating. I shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just old hay, wooden beams, and dust. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. A soft rustling sound from the far corner. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned the beam of the flashlight toward the noise. First, I saw nothing, but then, in the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure, just a shadow, but still a figure, moved quickly across the barn. My body went rigid, couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. Then I saw it, a man hunched over wearing tattered clothes. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with madness. He was watching me, standing in the corner of the barn, hidden in the shadows. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and bolted, running back to the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't process what I had just seen. It didn't make sense. There was no way anyone could have been living out there, especially not someone like that. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the cabin. I didn't care about the rental agreement or the money I had spent. I just wanted to get away. I drove back to the village, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers for. When I returned to the village, I went straight to the small store and asked about the cabin. The elderly shopkeeper gave me a strange look, as though she already knew what I was going to say. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I didn't know how to respond. "He's been there for years," she continued. "That man. No one knows where he came from. He's never hurt anyone, but he's always watching. He stays in that barn, waiting for someone to come around." I left the village that day, and I never went back to the cabin. The memory of that man, hidden in the shadows of the barn, still haunts me. I never found out who he was or how he ended up there. But I know one thing for sure: some places are better left alone.